It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to a new season of the Miller Center's American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. In just a few weeks, the nation will mark the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. Beginning with this program, American Forum will devote 5 episodes to a special examination of the impact and legacy of President Kennedy on civil rights, Vietnam, Latin America, and the assassination itself. We'll look at the successes, the failures, and fundamentally the question of why this one national leader and the people who surrounded him have maintained such an enduring hold on the interests and imagination of the American people. Our guest today is Barbara Perry, a widely known scholar of the U.S. Supreme Court and the American presidency. She's a senior fellow and associate professor at the Miller Center's Presidential Oral History Program at the University of Virginia. She's a frequent media commentator and one of the nation's most expert historians, not just about the presidency of John F. Kennedy, but in particular the Kennedy family and its perhaps unparalleled position as our country's most influential political dynasty. In 2004, Barbara Perry published a groundbreaking biography of Jacqueline Kennedy. Her newest book, published just in time for the anniversary of the assassination, looks at the mother of JFK, Rose Kennedy, the life and times of a political matriarch. Thanks for being with us, Barbara.
Thank you, Doug. It's great to be here.
Barbara, the stories of the first ladies of presidents, the characters of first ladies, have always, in some dimension, fascinated Americans. There has always been a wide public interest of at least some degree of the first ladies. Presidential mothers have not been as subject to as much attention or seen as such significant characters in the historical narrative. And presumably the interest in first ladies will eventually become first spouses in the relatively near future and not just be ladies. But what was it about Rose Kennedy that has made her become such an enduring figure in the American interest in the Kennedys? What is it that's so significant about her that justifies the level of interest that you bring with the book?
Well, I think I can sum it up by quoting Adlai Stevenson. And the photo on the book of Mrs. Kennedy whispering in the ear of her son took place at a dinner in December 1962. It was the first international awards dinner for research into mental retardation. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the Kennedy family's role in that. We don't know exactly what she's saying to the president, but clearly she has his ear, if not his full attention. But at that time, she was introduced at this dinner by Adlai Stevenson, who was the master of ceremonies, and he was the ambassador to the UN from the United States. And he introduced her by saying, Rose Kennedy is the greatest employment agent in the United States. And that was because in 1962, December of that year, one son was president of the United States. Her other son, Bobby, was the Attorney General, and her youngest son and youngest child, Teddy, had just been elected to the United States Senate. So she had 3 sons at the same time serving in Washington, and that alone, I think, would make her a mother for the ages, and certainly probably the best known and the most powerful of presidential mothers.
And her role in shaping the Kennedy boys primarily, who became the ones we knew the best and rose to these positions of great power. We know the story of Joseph P. Kennedy a little better, I think. He was a public figure in his own time, in his own right, and a subject of much attention. But between the two of them, what was the parenting partnership in a sense, and who was the primary sculptor of these men who became so famous?
Right. Well, and I'm going to add the women in as well,
sure,
because of course her daughter Eunice Kennedy Shriver was the founder of the Special Olympics. Her youngest daughter Jean Kennedy Smith, the only surviving child of Joe and Rose 9 children, and I had the honor of interviewing her in her lovely home in Manhattan. She was appointed to be ambassador to Ireland by President Clinton. So let's take the whole sweep of these 9 children. And I would say that Rose Kennedy and Joe Kennedy Sr. worked out a position for each of them, as you say, to sculpt the family. It was, quite frankly, the father, the patriarch, Joe Kennedy, who had the most influence over the sons, and Rose the most influence over the daughters, because Rose was born in 1890. She was very much a traditional mother and wife, and she had roles ceded to her that were typically female roles, and then she used those roles to their fullest and fullest potential. But certainly from the time the children were little, and her husband was already off beginning to make millions of dollars, first in banking, then in Hollywood and Wall Street, she was left to her own devices to raise this ever proliferating family. So in my view, it was the micromanagement side. And Rose said in her oral history that she was given the role of the stay-at-home, if you will, because at times she would leave to go abroad, but she was the stay-at-home mother, micromanaging all the details of the children's health. And we take that for granted now, but think of when her children were born, the first in 1915, 1917. She had 4 or 5 children in the first 5 to 6 years of her marriage. Health was a major issue for her because this was before the era of vaccines. And so she was 2 generations removed from the potato famine of Ireland. She was interested in getting these kids out into the suburbs outside of Boston, getting them into the fresh air, taking care of their health, and micromanaging every detail of their upbringing, their health, their education, their welfare.
So, a profoundly involved in the, at least in those aspects of their lives. Now, her own story, though, you mentioned essentially she is a Victorian
She is.
And an ardent Catholic, a deeply committed and faithful Catholic. She goes to a school. She's sent away to school at a convent, right? And I think it's a fascinating dimension of her that we'll talk more about. But she also was a political wife and a political woman long before she was a Kennedy. But tell us the sort of biography of Rose and how she became a political figure and a political operator.
Right, so born in 1890, really born into a political household. And we mentioned the role that she played in shaping her son's political careers. She brings the most political DNA to that marriage by being a Fitzgerald, because when she was 5 or 6 years old, in the middle of the 1890s, her famous father, Honey Fitz, the namesake of the future president, he was John F. Fitzgerald, so she named her second child, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Honey Fitz, as he was called for his very sweet voice and his propensity to break into song at every campaign rally and sing Sweet Adeline. He was the guiding force in Rose's life. And so Rose would say, when she was much older, she had been in the limelight from the time she was 5 or 6 years old, and she loved it. She loved to be in the spotlight. And then when she was a teenager, her father, Honey Fitz, was elected to be the mayor of Boston. And so she became almost the first woman, the first lady of Boston, because her mother was very shy, very introverted, did not like campaigning, did not like being in the spotlight. And Rose was the oldest of 6 children. So her mother was at home taking care of this brood of 5. Rose was out almost serving as the spouse to her father, Honey Fitz. So this is why she was so skilled on the campaign trail by the time her first son ran, John, in 1946 for Congress. But we must drop in as well the period that she spent as the wife of the ambassador to the court of St. James in the pre-war years in London as well. And
so she had also, though, spent time, because of her father being a member of Congress, she'd spent time in Washington as well, even though she primarily stayed home while he was in, but her experience with national politics was far beyond what would have been typical of any American, certainly a young woman in her time.
Right, and for that Victorian era, when, let us remember, for the first 30 years of Rose's life, women didn't have the vote in this country, and yet she did have this knowledge of public affairs and political affairs. Another habit that she picked up from her father, Honey Fitz, was he loved current events, in part because he was shaping them, at least on the local level, by the time he was mayor of Boston. But he would clip out current events from the newspaper, and so that he would remember them, he would pin them to his jacket and walk around with these newspaper clippings all over his jacket. Rose would do the same thing. As she had children, she would put those clippings up on a bulletin board for the kids to come and look at, and then she would quiz them on those current events at the dinner table. Now, when her husband was in town, he would take over that paternal role, and so he would run the conversations at the dinner. But for all of his absences, it was Rose who was running those conversations about current events, getting the kids interested in the history of their country. Up until the future president was 10 years old, so up to about 1927, the family lived in Brookline, just outside of Boston. So Rose would take them to all the historic sites. And then the family moved to New York, just outside of New York City, when the future president was 10 in the mid to late 20s. But she was not going to take those kids from New York after they had just moved from Boston out to California. So she was running the household, getting these kids prepared for school, getting them into good schools, and quizzing them at every opportunity about history, grammar, and spelling, as well as the church and theology.
She was the dean of the family
She
as well.
was the mayor and dean of the Fitzgerald Kennedy household.
It really is a fascinating portrait of a woman who is a bridge, really, between by today's standards, extraordinarily traditional and outdated, perhaps, by current perceptions, but in her time, a bridge between the type of woman that was her mother, entirely domestic in a sense, but where she is this, both playing the role that her mother played in so many respects with her family, but also this extremely powerful and influential figure, but at the same time self-effacing, particularly around the question of who's in charge in the family. I mean, she was asked about that once, even on a television interview that you write about, of who's the patriarch, who's the matriarch, who's really in charge here. But what was her view about that, and also what did she think of the changes that were happening to women, and was she a suffragette?
First of all, because she was born in this Victorian era and in a time when women couldn't even vote, she accepted her role graciously, that she knew that she had this female role. She tried to defy her father, Honey Fitz, by marrying the first boy she fell in love with, Joseph P. Kennedy. She fell in love with him on a beach vacation when both families, the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, were vacationing together in Old Orchard Beach, Maine. Rose was 16 years old, but the belle of Boston already because of her father. Honey Fitz was not that impressed with Joe Kennedy. He was a somewhat political rival of Joseph Kennedy's father, P.J. Kennedy, although they had come together and joined forces in Boston politics. Honey Fitz thought Joe Kennedy at 18 was too brash, that he was not good enough for his daughter, the Boston belle. He had already picked out a beau, and he hoped marriage material for her, a young man who lived in their neighborhood in Dorchester.
Who's that?
His name was Hugh Nawn, N-A-W-N, and he, Rose pointed out, he already had a car, or she would say, a car, and that really made him something, but he could just not overcome the charisma of Joe Kennedy, and she was just completely enamored of Joe and determined to marry him. So what did her father do but send her to a Prussian convent for what she thought was going to be 2 years, until she begged him to come home after 1 year. And he did let her come home. But she made the most of that. She became a Child of Mary, which was the highest award any of the students could earn at the Prussian convent. Happened to be in Holland, by the way, but it was run by Prussian nuns. She became a fluent speaker of French and German. She and her sister, who was sent with her, traveled all around Europe at the Christmas holidays. But she knew that she had this secondary role to her father, to her eventual husband, and within her church. Rose wanted to go to Wellesley, and she was an excellent student in high school, a straight-A student. She could have well been accepted to Wellesley. But her father was told by the Catholic Archbishop of Boston he shouldn't do that, because that would not be popular for a Catholic politician to send his daughter to a non-Catholic institution. And I like to think of the what-ifs. What would Rose Kennedy's intellect have been like if she had been allowed to expand it with a 4-year degree at Wellesley and mix in with women from all over the country, and particularly women who were not Catholic, and expand her worldview? She was not able to do that. You asked, was she a suffragette? She was not. I could say in no definition of the word feminist was Rose Kennedy a feminist. She was not, because she was so traditional. But on the other hand, again, she took the female roles that she was given by her church, her family, her society, and she made the most of those. And that turned out to be the basis of her power, especially as the men in her life began exiting the scene.
Now, you also describe very vividly that her life was one of astonishing wealth, significant wealth early, and astonishing wealth and privilege throughout most of her life, access to power, at the same time her Victorian sense of propriety, abiding Catholic faith. This long, long life, 104 years when she died. That's really amazing. But you also identify the darker manifestations of her personality. I mean, of which there were many. She was anorexic, I think. Do you ever specifically say that?
I'm a political scientist, not a doctor of medicine or a psychologist, but I would just point out that at the very least she had body image issues. Again, not unusual, I'm sure, for women of that era. But Rose was a petite by stature. She was only 5'3". She rarely weighed more than 120 pounds, and she always liked to keep on the thin side of that 120 line. She had what she called tummy troubles through her whole life, which in later years were diagnosed as irritable bowel syndrome. She and her husband were completely overwhelmed by their own weights and the weights of their children. They were forever hounding their children. Some were too thin, like Jack Kennedy was a sickly boy, so they were always telling him he was too thin, and Rose was trying to boost his weight by feeding him whole cream and whole milk and steak juice, and this was before the era of vitamins, but she was always trying to boost his weight up. Eunice was also a sickly child, so she was doing the same for her. Her first daughter, Rosemary, tended to be on the heavy side, as did the youngest child, Teddy, and they were always telling them, to their face and in writing, you're too fat, you need to lose weight. So they all had these body image issues, and I would say about Rose, given what I know about her perfectionistic personality, I would just say she had some of the symptoms that we might perhaps today call eating disorder.
Yeah, and so, but certainly, as you say, a kind of compulsive perfectionist, and who came at a certain point in her life to rely on sedatives and to sort of to cope with issues and things. So had some of the classic sorts of troubles. You write at one point, she demanded perfection from herself and attempted to perfect everyone and everything around her. What she couldn't perfect, she ignored or masked. That seems like a really telling line. But so what was you just described some of this, but what were the consequences for the children and for the family of this compulsive perfectionism and then her way of then managing the things that she couldn't fix?
Right. Well, I think the compulsive perfectionism in part comes from her mother, who was the same as she. Again, very Catholic and very perfectionistic in maintaining purity, let us say. She so admired the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the Blessed Virgin Mary is known for her purity. The Immaculate Conception, for example, that theological theory in Catholic theology. And so Rose is raised to be this perfectionistic young woman. And then, in my view, as she loses control in her life to her husband, to her father, to the church, to society, she tries to control everything and everyone around her. But let's face it, her children were not perfect, much to her upset, and she could not perfect them. And so she would keep after them in an attempt to perfect them, and then as they became in the public eye, she would just step aside and, as I said, ignore those imperfections, sometimes glaring imperfections. Her husband was not perfect either. They did not have a perfect marriage. And at one point, Doris Kearns Goodwin maintains that Rose Kennedy actually left her husband in about 1920 after her fourth child was born, went back to her parental home. And Honey Fitz said, sorry, dear, you are a Catholic woman. You are married in the eyes of the church. You cannot get divorced. You must go back and make the best of this situation. And that meant, as he said, if you need to hire more staff to help you with this large family that you have, do it. You have the money to do it. And then Rose also added another element to handling the situation. She would leave for long periods of time, even with small children behind. She would try to make sure her husband was on site when she left for long periods, but if he was not, they had the family Edward and Mary Moore, for whom Edward Kennedy was named. They were childless. They bought one of the Kennedys' homes in Brookline and forevermore became surrogate parents to the ever-growing Kennedy children. So when Rose would leave, she knew either her husband was there to take care of the children, or a whole household staff plus the Moores. But she did that, I think, to remove herself from these imperfections of her husband and her children. And quite frankly, I think she also did it as a form of birth control, because we must remember she would have had no access to any sort of artificial contraception. And so abstinence and absence were a way of controlling the number of children she had.
If only...
Imagine if she'd stayed at home more, there would have been more than 9.
Maybe more presidents.
More presidents, attorneys general, and senators.
If only we all had that option of indefinite departure to manage our marriages.
As a single person, I won't respond to that.
And as someone who's gone from home too much, I shouldn't say that. But let's talk a little further about the imperfections that you refer to, because it is another remarkable aspect of her life that she's surrounded by these absolutely extraordinary achievers, unimaginably great array of achievers, but also deeply troubled people, almost all of them in one respect or another. Her loved ones that troubled love lives, alcohol, chronic philandering, you know, her father, her husband, her sons, even a daughter, and all of this in contrast to her ramrod Victorian sensibilities. How did she manage that particular thing? I mean, you talked about it just now, but was it purely just to block out all of that conduct? But in the letters, is there something somewhere that gives us that a window into the turmoil that she must have felt about that?
Yes, indeed. And in addition to the 250 boxes of her papers that were opened at the Kennedy Library in 2006, and which I went through and prompted this book, which I hope will be viewed as the definitive biography, not only of Rose Kennedy, but the biography of her image and the Kennedy family image. I also came upon a private stash of her letters in a wonderful group of about 6 or 7 of them that were written from the time she was a teenager until the early 1930s. These were to a childhood friend of hers back in Boston. And the first letter from when she was a teenager talked to her friend about her hopes to attend Wellesley. So we take that and we say the first hope dashed, then the hopes dashed about the perfect marriage, and then the hopes dashed about her perfect children. So by the time she gets to the early 1930s, and her husband has been away in Wall Street and in California, and we know having a long-standing affair with Gloria Swanson, the screen siren of the 1920s. He was her manager, and it was well known that he had an affair with her. And we are certain that Rose had to know about this. But she never went on an Oprah-type show to talk about her feelings on that. In her own biography, her autobiography and memoir published in 1974, she said about her children, about her daughters and her daughters-in-law, she told them when they married, you will be in political life and you will hear gossip about your husbands. I did, my mother did. It's only that, it's gossip. But in a letter that she wrote in the early 30s to her childhood friend, she said, I'm sorry to have been out of touch for a while. She said, you might know my husband, Joe, was very, very successful in Hollywood. And in fact, we often went out with stars, including Gloria Swanson. We often went out with stars, including Gloria Swanson. This is also how Rose would deal with inconvenient truths. She would talk about them, but she would talk about them in a legitimate context. She was a friend of Gloria Swanson, and that was not a lie. She was a friend of Gloria Swanson. She traveled with her husband and Gloria Swanson. She traveled and had Gloria Swanson come to Hyannis to be with the family. So she wasn't making this story up. But to the outside world, even before the family was really famous, Rose took this approach, which was to maintain her own Victorian morals and mores and perfectionism, whether or not the family around her was going to maintain them.
And another of these inconvenient truths is one of the most unsettling narratives, I think, of the whole story, and that is the story of Rosemary, the mentally disabled daughter. And I want you to tell us that story. Some of us may know the basics of it, but I didn't know all. But also the fact that at a certain point in time, she is effectively, she disappears from the Kennedys' story of themselves, even though she's still alive for a very long time. But tell us about that.
Well, it is a moving and poignant story, to be sure, and one of the saddest of the many tragedies that befell Rose Kennedy. Rosemary was born in the fall of 1918 at the height of the Spanish flu epidemic. The family never really knew what caused what was then, when she was about 5 or 6, determined to be mental retardation, as it was called. Rose had noticed early on that this, her first daughter and third child, was not nearly as precocious as the first two, Joe Jr. and Jack. She was having trouble with physical coordination. She was writing backwards when she began to write. And after kindergarten at a public school in Brookline, Massachusetts, she was told by the teachers that Rosemary had a low IQ, we think about 70, and was therefore mentally retarded. Rose said she and her husband had never even heard that phraseology, mental retardation. So they were in Boston. They already had money and means. Rose went to Harvard, and she talked to all the experts in the field at the time, and they said, we're so sorry, but the only thing you can do, this would have been the mid-20s, is institutionalize your daughter. And the family refused. In fact, I think we should look at the positive of this story, and that is the Kennedys were among the first to mainstream a child who had a disability. They decided they couldn't send her to public school because she'd be too far behind. Of course, public school made no arrangements for children with disabilities at that time. So the Kennedys, being of means, could bring in private tutors, which they did. But they mainstreamed Rosemary. They had her participate in the athletics with the family and go sailing and learn how to play tennis and swim at her own level.
She's in the pictures?
She's in all the pictures of the families, including the pictures in London. So when Joe Kennedy Sr. is appointed by FDR to be the ambassador to the UK in the pre-war era in 1938, 39, and 40, the whole family decamps to London, and they take Rosemary along. Now, she does appear in the pictures. She is taken to Buckingham Palace and presented to King George and the Queen. She is sent to a convent, however, just near London, always with a caretaker. So the family would always have a governess or caretaker with her. By this time, Rosemary's in her late teens, and she's the most beautiful of the Kennedy
obviously, the
girls.
king declares her to be the most beautiful of the girls, right?
She is. And again, the most poignant parts I thought of reading Rose's papers are the letters from Rosemary to Rose and from Rose to Rosemary. First of all, the daughter is named for her mother, and Rose writes the most beautiful letters to her from her travels, and she will say, I'm in Italy, look up Italy on the map, and she's always teaching her, and again, finding the best tutors for her and making her feel part of the family.
And also pause on that for a second, because I think it's part of what makes the rest of the story so tragic, is that Rosemary she's writing letters back. She's not a person who's incapable of communication or incapacitated.
Not at all. She's writing letters that clearly are way below her grade level. So even when she is an older teenager approaching her 20s in London, by the way, she's the last child left behind when everyone else, as the war begins, is sent home. Joe stays as ambassador. Rosemary stays, but is placed away from the bombing of London, out again in convents with a caretaker. But she's writing constantly to her dad in, I would say, about a fourth or fifth grade style. Printing, she never learns to write cursive. Her mother changes her handwriting. In fact, when I went to interview Ambassador Jean Kennedy Smith in New York, I showed her a book about Honey Fitz, and I said, look, your mother signed this book, inscribed it, and she opened it up and she said, do you know why my mother wrote that way? And I said, yes, so your sister Rosemary could read the printing. So Rose changed all of her handwriting to be printed word rather than cursive. She would not speak French around Rosemary because Rosemary couldn't learn French, even though Rose was so proud of her fluency in the French language. So here's Rosemary writing proudly to her dad, Daddy, I am so happy to be the last child with you because I will take care of you. And he likewise would write to her and boost her pride and her self-esteem. But when the family returns, when all of them return as the war begins in earnest, Joe makes this fateful decision to lobotomize Rosemary. And at the time, that was considered to be almost a mainstream procedure. We must remember there were no pharmaceuticals for depression, for anxiety, seizures. Rosemary was experiencing all of those. And putting the mental retardation aside, Joe thought that the lobotomy would take care of these other issues she was having. The family also constantly worried, particularly Rose, after the Lindbergh kidnapping, that Rosemary would be kidnapped for ransom. That's why they always insisted that her siblings be with her or a caretaker be with her. As she grew to maturity, of course, they worried about the possibility of a rape or an unintended pregnancy. And so Joe was at his wit's end to look at something, some procedure that would take care of these problems that Rosemary had.
And it goes badly awry.
It went badly wrong. It infantilized her. And that is when she disappears from the family. She is institutionalized. By the way, Joe did not consult Rose about the procedure. The procedure was done, and then Joe came to Rose and the children and said a procedure was performed. They called it psychosurgery. It went badly wrong. Rosemary has been sent to an institution, but we mustn't visit her because it would be too disruptive. So for years, the family who loved this sister, loved this daughter, did not see her.
And essentially doesn't speak of her. I mean, she disappears from the public narrative for 20 years.
She does indeed. And if they do mention her, they do keep up this fiction, this facade, which they had been telling the press about her when she was mainstreamed with the family, and that she was studying to be a teacher. They would say, oh yes, she's at a convent school, she is studying to be a teacher. And they even did send her to summer camps, and she would help children with arts and crafts and the things that she could do. But they kept up that fiction that she was away. And then they would even say, once she was obviously an adult, they would tell when the president was running in 1960 to be president, when Senator John F. Kennedy was running, they would tell the press, oh, Rosemary is a teacher of retarded children at a school in Wisconsin, when in fact she was a patient there.
Yeah, it's quite a story. We know Rose Kennedy best as this figure associated with so much tragedy, the other tragedies that we know better, and the way that you took the 2 decades, though. Let's talk a bit more about Rosemary, of not acknowledging her, but then she returns to the narrative, as you say, during the presidential campaign, and then the family talks about her again and develops an interest in this issue that becomes fairly important.
Right. Well, and let's back up then to when the first tragedy, after Rosemary's lobotomy, when the next tragedy befalls the Kennedys, and that is the death of their eldest child, Joe Jr., in the war. In 1944, Joe, who had enlisted along with his brother Jack in the Navy, we know that Jack became a PT boat skipper in the South Pacific. Joe became a Navy pilot and was stationed in England, and had flown enough missions that he could have come home, but he decided to do one more mission, and it was a very dangerous mission whereby a plane that he would fly would be packed to the gills with explosives. He would fly it out over the English Channel, put it on a remote pilot, and it would then supposedly crash into these giant cannons that were hurling and about to hurl even worse ordnance on the city of London. We don't know exactly what happened, but when he set the fuse and was attempting to bail out, the plane exploded over the English countryside, and Joe was never found. The word comes to the Kennedy compound in Hyannis in August of 1944. Their beloved son, the son they had thought would become president of the United States and be the first Catholic president, was now gone. Joe and Rose were devastated. The family was devastated. But typical of the Kennedys, what do they do with this tragedy? But they form and establish the Joe Kennedy Jr. Foundation, which at that time was said to be for unfortunate children. So that would be for children who were poverty-stricken, but very quickly it takes on the mission of helping children who are mentally retarded. And we know that it exists to this day to do that. It has raised millions and millions of dollars for that cause. The Special Olympics is now part of it, thanks to Eunice Kennedy Shriver. So this is part and parcel how the family deals with this terrible tragedy, both for Joe Jr. as well as was for Rosemary. And Rose devotes her life to this cause.
Yes, and it's Rose that essentially convinces her husband to shift the focus of the foundation away from just unfortunate children generally to specifically to mental retardation, mental disability.
Right. We think that that is the case. She doesn't leave a lot of records in those 250 boxes about it, again, because she's a woman and it's the men of the family who are tending to run this foundation, and her husband is still very much a part of it. But it is the case that Rose is definitely now devoting her life to this cause. And so she begins to travel around first Massachusetts and then other cities where her kids begin to live after the war, and they open up hospitals that they name for Joe Jr. For disadvantaged children. And again, then suddenly the mission changes over to mental retardation. And then, as you also said, as President Kennedy, as he begins to run as a senator, the family, I think it's pretty clear to them they cannot keep the secret forever. So very suddenly, I found in Rose's interviews, as she is beginning to be interviewed about her son, Senator John F. Kennedy, running for president, she begins to mention Rosemary. Again, the fiction is continued that she is a teacher in Wisconsin. But early on in the president's term, Eunice Kennedy Shriver writes a story about Rosemary and tells the truth of her mental retardation.
And is there do you detect, I'm sure it's not laid out plainly, but you're willing in the book to surmise some things because you're compelled to because of her reticence about many things. Mm-hmm. But do you surmise a calculus in all of this? Was there actually do you imagine a conversation or an almost conversation in which there's okay, how do we deal with the question of Rosemary?
In a calculus,
Exactly.
A political calculus? I can't imagine such a thing. I'm sure if Joe Sr. had anything to do with it, of course there was a political calculus. I don't mean to indicate that about the foundation,
right.
because this is, of course, before the family.
Sure.
The children are involved in politics. Certainly Joe himself, Joe Sr., had political aspirations. He wanted to be the first Catholic president. He was the one who was giving loads of money to FDR and helping in his campaigns, and it was how he became the ambassador to the Court of St. James pre-war. But Joe Sr. made some very undiplomatic statements just before America entered the war in 1941, to wit, that probably Germany would succeed in conquering England, that democracy was dead, he said, probably in England, and perhaps in the United States. That was the end, you will not be surprised to hear, of Joe Kennedy Sr.'s career. And so he was politically toxic from that pre-war era onward and had to exit the stage. This also then becomes a power base for Rose. Now, was the family calculating about Rosemary, about the Joe Kennedy Jr. Foundation? I don't think so at the beginning. I think that the Joe Kennedy Jr. Foundation was genuinely there to help unfortunate children and then mentally retarded children. I think the issue of when to start talking about Rosemary probably was a calculation, just as anyone today would think in terms of media presentations and spins and that sort of thing.
But so the tragedies, let's go through them. That Joe was killed in World War II, the story of Rosemary that you've told, the daughter,
Kathleen was killed in an air crash in 1948.
Exactly. And then the assassination of the president, and then the assassination of the senator.
Shakespearean, isn't it?
It is. And at the same time, these extraordinary achievements of so many of these figures. How did the mother of these great achievements and the mother of these great tragedies, how did she reconcile those things?
Well, in public, she called them the agony and the ecstasy. She said, we have been given the highest of highs, about which she was ecstatic. Her proudest moment, she would say her proudest moment was when she held her firstborn child. But she would say shortly after that, her proudest moment was when she met the Pope. And then she would say her proudest moment was when her second child was inaugurated as president. But those were the ecstatic moments. And we know that the agonies that she faced were all the agonies of this litany of tragedies that you have just named for us. And how did she deal with them? Well, as a human being. And people have said to me, well, what have you discovered in these 250 boxes? And what did you discover that you didn't know about Rose Kennedy? And unfortunately, my brother, the WAG, said, you didn't find out that she was a pole dancer and off to the side? And I said, no, Doug, I didn't.
Sure?
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, there's nothing checking in the boxes that indicates that she was. But I said, I discovered she was more human than I thought, because I was raised in that generation that talked about the Kennedys as superhuman. My mother took me to see Senator John F. Kennedy when I was 4. In October 1960, he was campaigning in our hometown in Louisville. And she sat us in front of the podium so that we would see him. This was her political hero. We were Catholic. He was about to be the first Catholic president. And then in 1974 for Christmas, my mother gave me Rose Kennedy's biography and autobiography. And so I had this, I knew as I became a historian, a political scientist, that this was partly spin. But in going through all of these papers of Rose's, her letters, her diaries, her speeches, I realized that Rose was, of course, human. And so how did she deal with these tragedies? First off, her religion. She was convinced that she would see these departed children in the afterlife, so much so that she, in a conversation such as this, would say, well, I must tell the president that when I see him. This was after his assassination. People would be brought up short by her convincing statement, I must tell the president when I see him. So she was absolutely convinced that she would be reunited with all of her children and her husband who predeceased her in heaven. So that's a tremendous comfort, as you can imagine. She went to Mass every day, and that was comforting to her. She prayed the rosary every day, and she would say, and this would tie us to one of the points you brought up about the family having addiction problems. In Rose's somewhat naive way, she'd say, if only my children would, when they're nervous, pray the rosary instead of take a drink. She said it would be so much better for them, and they wouldn't gain weight. So that was particularly important. So all of these things, she said just the tactile blessing of holding a rosary in her hand, she felt tremendous comfort from that. And I have to say that coming from a Catholic family, I can well remember my own grandmother, when she would come to visit us, she would disappear in the afternoon. We'd say, where's Grandma? And then I'd go in the living room, and there she'd be, sitting quietly by herself in our living room praying the rosary. She prayed the rosary every afternoon, and she had tremendous comfort from that. So I saw that in my own family. I saw it with Rose Kennedy. Now, what's the other side of this coin? You mentioned sedatives, and that was something that I did discover in the papers. Her travel list, because she was so meticulous, she kept a travel log of everything she took on all of her many trips, and it was a rather people's pharmacy, I would call it, a traveling pharmacy of all sorts of medicaments that she was taking, including sedatives, because she freely admitted that after the assassination of President Kennedy, she had nightmares and terrible trouble sleeping, and the same after Bobby as well. She also, because of her stomach problems, took a common medication in those days, and I talked to elderly relatives who said they remembered having it, called paregoric, and it was used to settle a stomach, given to teething children, given to women with women's problems. It was opiate-based. And so I sometimes wonder if some of the addiction issues that the family faced could have been brought back to that. Over-the-counter medicine, we should say, until about 1970, when it was placed on the controlled substances list.
And I want to come back in just a second to November 22nd, 1963. But before that, tell us about her another self-treatment, I suspect, self-therapy, her fascination with celebrity autographs, and specifically her pursuit of an autograph from Nikita Khrushchev.
Yes. Well, remember how I told you from the time she was a little girl she was in the spotlight and that she loved to be in the spotlight. And one of her ways of being in the spotlight, and I think feeling important, because as a woman she was not allowed to be given important positions of power, she loved to be around important people, particularly in politics and in history. So every time she met a statesperson, a celebrity, she would ask them for an autograph, and autographs for her children, so she collected for them. If the celebrity or politician or statesperson had written a book, she would ask them to sign a book for the children, and she made a huge collection of autographed books. So in 1961, Rose, her son now newly inaugurated as president, Rose gets to go with Jackie and Jack on probably their most famous trip abroad, the famous trip in 1961 to Paris for President Kennedy to meet at the summit with de Gaulle, and to Vienna to meet at the summit with Khrushchev. Rose is in her element. She's speaking French in Paris. She's speaking German in Vienna. She's upset that Mrs. Khrushchev knows English because she had hoped she could speak French or German to her. And she is just loving this role that she's playing now as the mother of the president. And I make the case in the book that Rose was perhaps not the executive producer, that was Joe, her husband, but Rose played all the other roles in the family. She was the wardrobe mistress, she was the dialogue coach, she was the stage manager, and for herself, she played this important role eventually as mother of the president. So there she is, having photos taken of her and Khrushchev and de Gaulle, and after all is said and done, and she comes back from that trip, she finds photographs that she likes of Khrushchev, and she writes to him and says, would you write a nice note and please autograph these photographs? Well, her husband and now President of the United States, her son says, Mother, you might want to check with the State Department before you write to Khrushchev. Hello, it is the middle of the Cold War. But I love Rose's response. She wrote back in a letter, and I know she meant this as a humorous reply. She first of all said, Dear Jack, I understand. I won't write to Khrushchev any longer. And she said, good thing you let me know, because she said, I was just getting ready to write to Castro to ask for... to ask for his autograph. And now that could have been true, but I think I got to know her humor well enough that she also knew when she had stepped beyond the bounds of propriety and diplomacy, and she took her penance, which was to have her son, the president, write and say, please don't do this anymore, or if you do, please go through channels.
Well, she's such a complicated person, a complicated woman, a complicated mother. She's clearly, she's human and she's warm and caring in these other ways. She's also harsh and cold in other respects. Ted Kennedy writes about a pretty tough mom in some respects and a very sensitive mother. Your depiction of her made me think that she was sort of a 1940s era version of what's been called lately the Tiger Mom.
Absolutely. She was the Irish version of the Tiger Mom, which is viewed as an Asian stereotype,
exactly.
But she was the Irish version of that. Or we would say today a helicopter mom, to be sure. And you say she's complicated. This book also proved to me she was a woman of paradoxes, and that was one of them, that she was micromanaging on one level, and after the children about so many details of their lives, hovering over them at every turn, writing to the wife of the headmaster at Choate when Jack was there and suffering from ill health, saying she couldn't come because she was having her own ill health, but could the headmaster's wife please take care of Jack, make sure that he was eating vegetables because he tended to eat sweets, and make sure that he used the supports in his shoes because he had flat feet. And it wasn't just that Jack had these issues as any adolescent boy might, but these were character flaws in Jack. It wasn't just that he was like a regular adolescent boy and he ate sweets and not vegetables, but to Rose this was a character flaw. So she was always hovering, sometimes not landing, however, because she didn't always go and be on site with her kids when they were in prep school, but she was always after them to do the right thing as she defined that.
And whatever this means, was she a good mother?
I think that she was. I think she was. And I have to say that in her good roles, in her roles as this very caring mother, as the mother who took care of these children and made sure that their health was well. I have an aunt who's 92 who is of the same era as Rose's children, and she tells me, milk was hard to come by in those days. It was hard to get the kinds of health things that were needed for children. And so she says you need to give Rose credit for that alone, but also the educational side, the telling the children about history. One of my colleagues here today talks about the Republican motherhood, the concept of Republican motherhood, which has been applied to the mothers of our founders, that they were creating virtuous citizens to run our country. And I think that that's what Rose Kennedy did. That's how she, in my view, is also the same as my own mother. My mother was it's another generation down the road, but was a Victorian. My mother was a perfectionist, and nothing made my mother prouder than to have people at church say to her, "Your children look so good when they come to Mass on Sundays." That was the highest compliment that could be paid my mother, bless her heart. And she looked after our health and our education. Now the difference is my mother was wonderful and warm and cared for us in every way and was always there for us. Rose was not. Rose was not always there for the reasons we talked about earlier. Getting away from a philandering husband. My mother had 3 children, Rose had 9, and I think Rose's kids were more boisterous than we were. And so Rose literally had a cottage built on the beach in Hyannisport to get away from the kids in the main house. She said, "I couldn't stand these games that they played when they were shouting all the time." So she would go to this little cottage, and she would have her books and her letters, and she'd swim in the ocean, and she just had to get away. Well, twice hurricanes came and washed away 2 of her cottages. And so she said, in her typical wit, she said, "So I just had to start going to Paris instead." My mother did not do that. My mother was always with us. But Rose, in that sense, has been referred to, I think, as a cold mother or an absent mother. She was often not there for the reasons, again, described. And she had to get away from the boisterousness, and I think to go and travel by herself was, again, a form of contraception.
And tell us about November 22nd, 1963 for Rose Kennedy.
Rose Kennedy got up that morning, and as she did every morning, it was a Friday, as probably most people remember. It was a beautiful day for her to go to Mass. She went to early Mass every day. It was, she said, a crystal clear blue sky day, a golden day at Hyannisport on Cape Cod. And she had not yet gone, she had gone to Mass, she'd come home and had lunch with her husband, who by this time, and we haven't even talked about this tragedy, her husband was struck by an incapacitating stroke in December of 1961 and was really unable to speak intelligibly from then on, but lived until 1969. So she would typically have lunch with him. They would sometimes take a drive. So they took a drive around Cape Cod, and then, of course, after lunch, she got the word from Bobby. The Attorney General, her son, called her to say Jack had been shot at a motorcade in Dallas. They weren't sure exactly the extent of the wound. Bobby called again to say it did not look good for Jack. Rose went out on the beach. She did what she always did in times of sorrow and tragedy. She retreated to be by herself. She couldn't really talk to her husband because he could not converse with her. And she and her husband had this plan through their whole lives, all of their married lives. They would not tell each other bad news. They would try, if they were apart from each other and there was bad news, they didn't want to worry the other. If something could be held over to the next day, they would say, let's try to give the other a good night's rest. So Rose did not tell Joe what had happened. And then she got the call from Bobby that Jack was gone. And she retreated to her room, and she paced around, and she put things in order, and she said the rosary. But what kept coming back to her was why? And even Rose, who was convinced she would see Jack in the afterlife, but even she couldn't understand. And she would later say, going back to this concept of Republican motherhood, I spent years raising these children to be educated and to be well-trained and to be perfect and to serve their country. And in one fell swoop, it was gone. Even she questioned God. She could not understand it. But then she would say, I would just say God knew better than I, and I would have to accept his will. And so soon she was off to Washington to go to the funeral of her son.
Well, but that day she takes another phone call from Lyndon Johnson, and she calls him Mr. President.
She does. She takes this phone call from the president, the new president.
30 minutes.
30 minutes after he's been sworn in. He's on Air Force One. He's coming back from Dallas with the remains of her son in the cabin. And Rose is completely poised. We have that recording here at the Miller Center, and people can go on www.millercenter.org and type in Rose Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and they can listen to Lyndon Johnson conversing with Rose Kennedy. And she says to him when he comes on the line, Mr. President, it is Rose, the poised wife of the diplomat. Even though she's just suffered yet another and maybe the worst tragedy she ever suffered, she is completely poised and compos mentis in talking to the president. And then Lady Bird gets on the line, and it's Lady Bird whose voice is breaking with pain and sorrow for Rose. And Rose is completely poised and completely at ease with herself in talking to the new president. Then she's off to the funeral. You do not see Rose breaking down in tears in public. She looks utterly devastated, of course, at St. Matthew's Cathedral and at Arlington Cemetery. And yet she flies back that night to the compound to be utterly alone because, again, her husband cannot speak with her. She can't even share this emotion and this tragedy with him.
And so what is your answer to this question of that 50 years later, as these events, the events of particularly President Kennedy's life, do begin to recede into a history that is less palpably significant in the life of the nation today. But we're 50 years later, and yet we still have this extraordinary fascination with him and this family and their role in American life. But why is that? Why are we so singularly fascinated with this particular group of people?
Well, I said before when you were listing out the tragedies, it's Shakespearean, it's biblical. Those stories remain with us, even if it is one tragedy, Abraham Lincoln. We are still fascinated by Lincoln. We're fascinated by his assassination. When you have a family that has these kinds of tragedies in multiples, and when you have someone like Rose Kennedy, who was in the spotlight and was so willing to tell her story as she saw it and contribute to the image of this family for history. And she said when she would turn over the house where President Kennedy was born in Brookline, she bought it, she redid it, she created the image that she wanted of him, and then she deeded it over to the United States in 1969. And at that time, she pointed up to the window of the bedroom where the president was born, and she said, when you hold your child in your arms for the first time, you know what influence you might have over him. She just said him, not her, over him for that person's life, and she said, for time and eternity. And so Rose saw her story and the story of her family being one that would be retold over and over, not only in this country, but around the world.
Thanks again, Barbara Perry.
Thank you, Doug.